SproutsCast. Good to see you today. This is SproutsCast Tuesday edition, story time. So I've really been excited, enjoying learning about Jim Elliott, a missionary to where? This is good?
He is going to Ecuador.
Ecuador. That's exciting. How have you been?
I've been doing good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing real well. I enjoy being able to get to the camera and be with you guys. Even though I'm not with you.
Yeah,
and,
it's really been different and kind of sad at the same time because we haven't been able to be with our friends and all you youngsters here in classes and everything, but hopefully we'll be back together again soon.
Yeah, we will be. I have faith. We'll be back together again soon. So, are you ready for your story, Mrs. Good?
Yes, we're going to start chapter 3 today.
Chapter 3. All right, sounds good. Learning about Mr. Jim Elliott, a missionary to
Ecuador in his book One Great Purpose by Jim Elliott. So we will get going here on chapter 3, and chapter 3 is called The Letter. So let's see what chapter 3 is all about with the letter. The Santa Juana hugged the coastline as it steamed southward past Mexico and on to El Salvador, where it had cargo to deliver. While the ship bobbed at anchor off La Libertad, unloading large crates of goods onto tender boats, Jim, Pete, and 4 of the other passengers went ashore. The 6 of them hired a taxi to drive them to San Salvador, the capital city of El Salvador. Although the city was every bit as noisy, busy, and dirty as Jim had imagined it would be, Jim loved every minute he spent there. With the sightseers safely back aboard the Santa Juana, weighed anchor and continued on its journey south. Jim was so busy writing to people back home on the postcards he's bought in San Salvador that he didn't even notice the coastline of Nicaragua slip by. The following day, as they steamed past Costa Rica, the captain invited Jim and Pete to go shrimping with him, the chief steward, and the second engineer. Jim helped the second engineer haul the canvas cover off the motorboat that sat in a cradle on the aft deck. Once the cover was pulled clear, the boat was swung overboard by one of the derricks and lowered into the water. Soon, Jim, Pete, and the second engineer were joined in the boat by the captain and the chief steward, who scaled down the rope ladder lowered over the side of the ship. The captain had had a very late night and almost immediately fell asleep at the back of the boat. He did not wake up again until the boat was ready to be hauled back onto the ship. The other 4 men, though, had a lively time. They threw out nets behind the boat and hauled in 150 pounds of the biggest, plumpest shrimp Jim had ever seen. But it wasn't just the shrimp that delighted Jim. The contents of the net were a marine biology exhibit spread out in front of him to examine. Wiggling in the net were several hammerhead sharks, squid, sharp-toothed corbina, and blowfish, a stingray, a sea cat, and many other weirdly shaped fish that even the steward could not identify. All in all, the outing was a great success, especially since Jim and Pete had had the opportunity to discuss at length with the second engineer their reason for going to Ecuador. The final days of the voyage rushed by. The ship skirted the coast of Panama, then Colombia, and finally was steaming down the coast of Ecuador. The day before they were due to dock, Jim reread the letter he had received from Dr. Tidmarsh several days before sailing from San Pedro. Dr. Tidmarsh had expressed his delight that someone was coming to take over the mission base he had established in Shandai. There was still lots of missionary work to be done there. Dr. Tidmarsh also said he would be at the dock in Guayaquil when Jim and Pete arrived and would have airline tickets for them to fly to Quito. As Jim read the letter, he couldn't help but think of why he had decided to become a missionary in Shandai, a tiny dot on the map surrounded by dense jungle. Some people called the string of events that had led him to choose Shandai mere coincidence. But Jim believed differently. To him, it was the hand of God guiding him towards his destiny. The first time Jim had ever heard of the Quechua Indians and Shandai had been in a letter from his older brother Bert, who had been a missionary in Peru. Tucked inside Bert's letter to Jim was a letter addressed to Bert and signed by a Dr. Wilfred Tidmarsh. As Jim read that letter, he became very excited. Dr. Tidmarsh had been working for many years among the Quechua Indians in eastern Ecuador. He had set up a mission station in the jungle in a place called Shandai and had established a school for boys and a medical clinic. As a result, several Quechuas had become Christians. Dr. Tidmarsh's wife had become ill, however, and was in need of constant medical attention. As a result, the family was going to have to relocate to the city where Mrs. Tidmarsh could get the medical help she needed. Dr. Tidmarsh was greatly saddened at having to leave the mission station he'd spent so many years establishing. So he had written to Bert in the hopes that Bert might know someone willing to take over the work in Shandai. By the time Jim had finished reading the letter, his heart was racing. Jim immediately began to respond to the doctor's request. This was just what he had been waiting for. 15 minutes later, the letter offering his services to Dr. Tidmarsh was sealed in an envelope and ready for a stamp. But just then, a thought struck Jim. Instead of asking God whether this was the next move for him, he had presumed it was. He looked at the envelope and shook his head. He knew he could not send that particular letter, but he could write another one, a more general one, asking Dr. Tidmarsh for information about Shandai and the Quechua Indians. The next time Shandai grabbed Jim's attention was in the summer of 1950, while he was at Camp Wycliffe in Oklahoma City. Camp Wycliffe was an amazing experience for anyone interested in becoming a missionary. Several hundred people attended, staying in university dormitories while the students were in summer recess. Some who attended the camp were older missionaries planning to go into new or unreached areas of the mission field, but most were like Jim, with little or no missionary experience. Jim loved everything about the camp. Mealtime was filled with interesting conversation about real missionary experiences, and Jim sat in classes with Christian workers from all over the world. Most of all, Jim loved what he was learning in the classroom. Classes were divided into 3 topics. The first was phonetics, where Jim learned to listen to the different sounds of a language and write them. Sometimes this was difficult because some language had gulping, humming, and clicking sounds that were not easy to put into writing using the English alphabet. However, phonetics was an important skill to master because a missionary who wanted to write in another language would first have to listen carefully and write down the various sounds of the language. Next was morphology class. Here, Jim learned how to find out what words were related to others in foreign language. While the English language used prefixes and suffixes to slightly change the meaning of a word, other languages did not, so it was important to know how to discover what words were linked to each other. Finally, there was syntax class, where Jim learned how to discover the way a sentence was put together in a foreign language. All of these classes required a lot of hard study, but Jim enjoyed the challenge. Once the students had been taught the basics of learning and writing in a foreign language, it was time for them to try out in a real situation what they had learned. To help them do this, the camp organizers had brought in what they called informants, missionaries who had lived in remote areas of the world and had mastered these little-known languages. Each student was given an informant to work with for a month. It then became the student's task to listen to the language the informant spoke and, using the principles learned in the first half of the school, figure out how the language was put together. Students waited eagerly to see who their informant would be, and no one was more eager than Jim Elliott. Finally, Jim was introduced to a retired missionary who had been working in Ecuador among the Quechua Indians. Jim could hardly believe it. He began to think it was more than a coincidence that Bert had sent him Dr. Tidmarsh's letter, and that he was about to spend a month with a man who had worked with that exact Indian tribe. The next few weeks were fascinating for Jim. From his informant, Jim learned that the Quechua Indians numbered a little over 800,000 people, but had only 5 missionaries working among them. Even after all the times he'd preached on the need for foreign missionaries, it was still mind-boggling for Jim to think that there were only 5 missionaries serving nearly 1 million people. Something in Jim stirred. This time he felt more certain that God wanted him to go to the Quechua Indians. In one of their conversations, Jim's informants mentioned a tribe that Jim had never heard of, the Auca Indians. Jim paid rapt attention as he learned that the Aucas were one of the most difficult tribes in the entire world to reach. The Aucas were a people shrouded in mystery, still living in the Stone Age just miles from one of the most sophisticated oil exploration operations on Earth. And they didn't like outsiders, killing most of them on sight. As a result, little was known about the tribe. Jim could feel the hair on the back of his neck rise as his informant told him all he knew about the Aucas. Jim prayed that one day he might get to meet them himself and play a role in introducing the gospel message to their tribe. As Camp Wycliffe came to an end, Jim needed a plan for the future. He set aside 10 days to pray and ask God for guidance. During this time, little things began to attract his attention. A missionary friend in Africa wrote to say she was praying especially for him because she felt he had an important decision to make. Someone put $20 and an anonymous note in his mailbox. The note read, "God bless you. This is for Ecuador." And his mother forwarded a letter from Dr. Tidmarsh that gave more information on the Shandai and the missionary work there. At the end of the 10 days, Jim felt God was indeed calling him to Ecuador, and soon he wrote to the elders of the Brethren Church in Portland asking if they would sponsor him to be a missionary. He also wrote to Dr. Tidmarsh to tell him he was interested in taking over the missionary work at Shandai. Dr. Tidmarsh, who had already moved to Quito, Ecuador's capital city, was thrilled to hear that someone would be replacing him among the Quechua Indians. There was one final matter Jim was sure would confirm whether or not God wanted him in Ecuador. It was the matter of the draft board. Jim's childhood had been lived safely in the midst of a loving family and a tight community. It had been ideal in many ways except for a single cloud: World War II. The United States had entered the war in 1942 when Jim was 14 years old and continued until August 1945 when he was 17. During this time, many young men had been drafted into the armed services. But by the time Jim attended Camp Wycliffe in 1950, the war had been over for 5 years. However, a standoff had developed in Europe between the Soviet Union and the United States and its allies. The standoff became known as the Cold War. As a result, every young man in the United States over the age of 18 had to enroll with the draft board and be ready to fight if the need arose. Before he could travel overseas long term, Jim had to receive permission from the draft board. After waiting anxiously for several weeks, Jim received notice from the draft board that he'd been granted permission to leave the United States. All of these events, some large, some small, led Jim to where he was right at that moment, a few hours away from the end of his voyage and setting foot in his newly adopted land of Ecuador. On February 21st, 1952, the Santa Juana dropped anchor off Puna Island in the Gulf of Guayaquil. Jim and Pete watched as a small yacht, the Santa Rosita, tied up alongside the freighter. The captain had already explained to them that no dock in Guayaquil was large enough for the Santa Juana. The passengers disembarking there would have to be transferred to a smaller vessel, the Santa Rosita, to go ashore while their baggage and other cargo would be transferred to the barges and towed in by a tugboat. The captain told Jim it would take about 4 hours for the Santa Rosita to make the 30-mile trip up the river to Guayaquil. Jim and Peter thanked the captain for his hospitality before climbing the rope ladder, slung over the side of the freighter and onto the deck of the Santa Rosita. Feeling a surge of excitement, Jim was eager to get ashore and meet Dr. Tidmarsh, who would be waiting for them at the dock. Jim and Pete stood on the foredeck of the Santa Rosita as she plowed her way up the Guayas River. An assortment of boats paraded by: dugout canoes loaded with an enormous stock of bananas or mounds of coconuts, small ferry boats filled with passengers, barges stacked with crates of cargo, and fishing boats with their nets hanging to dry in the hot afternoon sun. Finally, a little more than 4 hours after leaving the Santa Juana, the young missionaries reached the bustling port of Guayaquil, just south of where the Dual River flowed into the Guayas. 20 minutes later, the Santa Rosita was tied up firmly alongside the dock and the passengers began to disembark. Jim stood on the deck and scanned the milling crowd for Dr. Tidmarsh, but he could see no white face. Not to worry, by the time he and Pete clambered up onto the dock, Dr. Tidmarsh would emerge from the rear of the crowd. But when he did not, Jim and Pete wondered what they should do next. And that is where we are going to leave off. What is going to happen? Is Dr. Tidmarsh going to show up, or did something happen to him? I wonder. You're going to have to tune in next week on Tuesday to find out the next chapter in our book, One Great Purpose.